From the infamous ADX Florence in Colorado, where prisoners spend 23 hours a day in concrete silence, to USP Marion in Illinois, where freedom is reduced to walking in circles inside a cage, to USP Lewisburg in Pennsylvania, where prisoners are double-celled in tiny concrete rooms, often with violent rivals. These are 10 U.S. prisons for cartel members that are worse than death. ADX Florence. Deep in the unforgiving terrain of the Colorado Rockies, surrounded by layer upon layer of razor wire, and armed with the most advanced security technology that human ingenuity can devise, stands ADX Florence, the highest security prison in the United States. This fortress of reinforced concrete and hardened steel has earned its chilling nickname as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, and for reasons that will become terrifyingly clear as we explore its depths. Opened in January 1995, ADX Florence was commissioned in direct response to escalating violence in federal prisons, particularly after the brutal, calculated murders of correctional officers at other facilities exposed the inadequacy of traditional maximum security measures. The most notorious cartel member to call this concrete tomb home is Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the former Sinaloa cartel leader, who was sentenced to life plus 30 years in 2019. His transfer to ADX Florence was specifically chosen not just to prevent any possibility of another escape, but to send a message to the criminal underworld. No matter how powerful you become, no matter how many armies you command or governments you corrupt, America's supermax system will reduce you to nothing more than a number in a concrete box. In 2023 and 2024, Guzman wrote desperate letters requesting transfer to Mexico and visitation rights, citing unbearable psychological torment. But these pleas were categorically denied. Inmates at ADX Florence are confined to 7 by 12-foot cells for 23 hours a day, but these aren't just small spaces. They're carefully designed sensory deprivation chambers engineered to minimize human contact and environmental stimulation to the absolute minimum possible while keeping inmates alive. Each cell contains only the most basic essentials for survival: a poured concrete bed, desk, stool, a combination toilet sink unit, and a shower with a timer that prevents flooding, but also prevents any semblance of normal hygiene routines. The single window in each cell measures just 4 inches by 4 feet and is deliberately angled to show only a thin sliver of sky, preventing inmates from ever developing any sense of their surroundings, the passage of time, or any connection to the natural world outside. The facility employs 1,400 remote-controlled steel doors, sophisticated motion detectors, and thousands of surveillance cameras that monitor every movement, every gesture, every moment of every inmate's existence. 8 guard towers equipped with high-powered rifles provide constant oversight, while pressure pads buried in the ground, laser beam detection systems, and armed patrols ensure that absolutely every movement is monitored, recorded, and analyzed. But if you think the calculated cruelty of ADX Florence represents the depths of American prison brutality, you haven't seen anything yet. Our next destination takes us back in time to where these nightmare techniques were first perfected: USP Marion. This facility holds a unique and absolutely terrifying place in the dark history of American corrections. It was the first federal control unit prison, serving as the diabolical blueprint for every supermax facility that followed. USP Marion was established in 1963 as a replacement for the infamous Alcatraz, designed to house the federal system's most dangerous and disruptive inmates in what officials believed would be a more modern, more humane approach to maximum security incarceration. But it was the horrific events of October 22nd, 1983, that would transform this facility into something that would make Alcatraz seem almost merciful by comparison. On that blood-soaked day, 2 correctional officers, Merle Klutz and Robert Hoffman, were brutally murdered by inmates Thomas Silverstein and Clayton Fountain, both vicious members of the Aryan Brotherhood white supremacist prison gang. Inmates were confined to their cells for 23 hours a day, with minimal human contact, no communal activities, and security measures so strict they resembled something from a dystopian nightmare. The conditions during Marion's supermax era were deliberately and scientifically designed to inflict maximum psychological damage while keeping inmates technically alive and physically unharmed. Inmates were confined to 6 x 8-foot cells with concrete beds, minimal furnishings, and absolutely no personal possessions that might provide comfort, distraction, or any connection to their former lives or identities. Meals were passed through bars like feeding animals in a zoo, and recreation was limited to 2 hours per week in a small enclosed concrete area that resembled a cage more than any reasonable interpretation of outdoor exercise time, but it was the specialized housing units that truly revealed the depths of Marion's calculated cruelty and the lengths to which prison officials would go to break their most dangerous inmates. The H unit, known throughout the federal prison system as the Hole, required inmates to be shackled and escorted by multiple officers, with humiliating strip searches conducted before and after every single cell exit. The K unit, euphemistically called the Director's Unit, housed high-profile inmates in complete isolation, with larger cells. John Gotti, the infamous Gambino crime family boss and one of the most powerful organized crime figures in American history, was housed in Marion's H unit after violent conflicts with other inmates. The psychological impact of Marion's conditions was so severe and so systematically destructive that human rights groups, including Amnesty International, condemned the facility's conditions as cruel and unusual punishment, arguing they violated not just constitutional protections, but basic standards of human decency. However, our next facility looked at Marion's methods and decided they weren't cruel enough. USP Lewisburg. USP Lewisburg opened in 1932 as one of the first federal penitentiaries in American history, initially designed with the progressive ideals of rehabilitation and reform that characterized early 20th century penology. However, it was the implementation of the Special Management Unit, SMU, in 2009 that transformed this facility from a challenging but manageable prison into something that can only be described as a deliberate experiment in human suffering. The SMU was ostensibly designed to house the Bureau of Prisons' most dangerously violent, confrontational, defiant, antagonistic inmates, a clinical description that fails utterly to capture the reality of what this designation would mean for the human beings subjected to its conditions. What made Lewisburg's approach particularly brutal and psychologically devastating was their implementation of what they euphemistically called double-celled solitary confinement, a contradiction in terms that created conditions so inhumane they challenge our understanding of what civilized society should tolerate. The SMU housed inmates in 6x 8-foot cells designed for one person, forcing two prisoners to share this impossibly small space for 23 hours a day, creating a pressure cooker environment that made violence not just likely, but absolutely inevitable. The 1991 documentary, Doing Time: Life Inside the Big House, provided an early glimpse into this nightmare, highlighting the presence of Cuban drug cartel members held under strict solitary confinement conditions at Lewisburg, noting that attempts to extradite them to Cuba were unsuccessful. These inmates, branded as lifers with absolutely no prospect of parole or release, were subjected to extreme isolation that systematically destroyed their mental health and human connections, leaving them as living ghosts haunting the corridors of this Pennsylvania prison. The predictable results of this policy were horrific beyond any reasonable description or justification. Reports detail frequent savage violence, with cellmate assaults including brutal stabbings, vicious beatings, and one particularly horrifying instance where an inmate tore off half of his cellmate's ear in a frenzy of violence born from impossible living conditions. A comprehensive joint investigation by NPR and the Marshall Project found that Lewisburg had 6 times more inmate-on-inmate assaults than other federal prisons, with 10 murders, at least 1 suicide, and over 800 documented fights since 2010. Inmates who refused were subjected to ambulatory restraints or 4-point restraints, where wrists and ankles were shackled for days or even weeks at a time. Sebastian Richardson, a former inmate whose testimony helped expose these practices, reported being shackled for nearly a month, resulting in permanent physical damage including long-term pain, swelling, and numbness that continued long after his eventual release. But this psychological torture pales in comparison to what awaits us next, where violence has become a way of life. USP Beaumont. In the sweltering heat of East Texas, where the humidity hangs heavy in the air and the landscape seems to absorb hope itself, stands USP Beaumont, a fortress of concrete and steel that has become synonymous with some of the most shocking, coordinated, and brutal violence ever witnessed within the American federal prison system. The strategic location of this facility cannot be understated in understanding its role in the broader war against organized crime. USP Beaumont is part of the Federal Correctional Complex in Beaumont, Texas, which houses approximately 1,350 male inmates in a high-security environment specifically designed for individuals who pose the most significant security risks to society. The facility's proximity to the Mexican border makes it a natural and logical destination for cartel members who have been extradited to the United States. But what awaits them inside goes far beyond anything they might have experienced during their years of criminal activity on the outside. The defining moment that exposed the true horror and systematic violence of USP Beaumont came on January January 31st, 2022, when the facility erupted in unprecedented, coordinated violence that would shock the entire federal prison system and force a nationwide response. 7 MS-13 members orchestrated a deadly, calculated attack within USP Beaumont's AA housing unit, specifically targeting rival gang members from the Sureños and Mexican Mafia, in an assault that demonstrated the reach and coordination of international criminal organizations operating within American prisons. The assault was so brutal, so coordinated, and so thoroughly planned that it resulted in the deaths of 2 inmates and left 2 others with severe, life-threatening injuries, requiring immediate hospitalization and extensive medical intervention. But the sheer numbers don't capture the horrifying reality of what these men endured in their final moments, or the terror experienced by everyone who witnessed this explosion of organized violence. The details of this attack are almost too horrific to comprehend, representing a level of brutality that challenges our understanding of what human beings are capable of inflicting upon one another. Guillermo Riojas was repeatedly stabbed in the chest, heart, and lung with makeshift weapons, his life draining away on the concrete floor of a housing unit that was supposed to provide security and safety. Even more horrifying was the fate of Andrew Pineda, who was stabbed 46 times in a frenzy of violence that continued long after any reasonable person would have recognized that death was inevitable. What we've seen in Texas is shocking, but our next destination shows us something far more insidious: USP Atlanta. USP Atlanta opened in 1902 as one of the oldest federal penitentiaries in the United States, and over its long, troubled history, it has housed some of the most notorious criminals ever incarcerated, including Al Capone, John Gotti, Whitey Bulger, Bernie Madoff, and Carlo Ponzi. But it's not the facility's famous inmates that make it notorious. It's the absolutely horrific, inhumane conditions that have persisted for decades, creating an environment so systematically destructive that federal judges have taken the unprecedented step of refusing to send defendants there, citing concerns about basic human rights and constitutional violations. The true scope of Atlanta's institutional horror was exposed in devastating detail through a comprehensive 2022 Senate investigation led by Senator John Ossoff, which revealed conditions so shocking they defied belief even among seasoned prison investigators who had seen the worst the system had to offer. The investigation documented abusive and inhumane conditions that included mold-infested walls creating toxic air that inmates were forced to breathe 24 hours a day, broken air conditioning systems that left prisoners to swelter in Georgia's brutal summer heat without relief, inoperable elevators that trapped disabled inmates on floors where they couldn't access basic services, and sewage backups that left human waste floating in recreation areas sometimes up to a foot deep. But perhaps most shocking of all was the complete breakdown of basic sanitation and pest control that revealed how thoroughly the facility had abandoned any pretense of proper management. Rats and roaches were not just present but prevalent in food preparation areas and cells, with staff actually leaving doors open for stray cats to roam the prison corridors in a desperate, futile attempt to control the rat population. A massive security lapse that demonstrated just how completely the facility had abandoned any semblance of proper institutional control. Imagine being a cartel leader who once commanded respect and fear across continents, who lived in luxury and wielded power over life and death, suddenly reduced to sharing your concrete cell with disease-carrying rodents, while feral cats prowl the corridors in scenes that would be rejected as too unrealistic for a post-apocalyptic movie. The environmental conditions were matched and amplified by equally horrific neglect of the most basic human needs required for survival. Inmates, including pretrial detainees who hadn't even been convicted of any crime, were systematically denied clean drinking water, proper nutrition, basic hygiene products, and access to medical care. The neglect in Atlanta is devastating, but our next stop combines that with systematic, uncontrolled killing. USP Pollock. USP Pollock is a high-security federal prison for male inmates located in the unincorporated wilderness of Grant Parish, Louisiana, established in 2000 with a capacity of 1,300 inmates. Its remote location serves multiple sinister purposes that go far beyond simple security considerations. It makes escape virtually impossible due to the surrounding inhospitable terrain. It limits family visits to an absolute minimum due to the difficulty and expense of reaching the facility, and most psychologically devastating of all, it creates an atmosphere of complete isolation that begins to break inmates psychologically long before they even enter their cells. What sets Pollock apart from other high-security facilities isn't just the shocking level of violence that occurs within its walls, though that violence is truly staggering in its frequency and brutality, but the systematic institutional nature of that violence and the complete failure of authorities to maintain even the most basic safety standards for inmates. The prison is frequently cited among the most dangerous prisons in the United States due to its violent environment, extensive gang activity, and harsh conditions that create a perfect storm of factors that make violence not just likely, but inevitable. The statistics paint a picture of uncontrolled carnage that would be shocking in a war zone, much less a facility supposedly designed to provide secure but humane detention. Reports indicate that at least 3 murders have occurred within the facility, with 2 cases remaining completely unsolved, creating an atmosphere where killers walk freely among the general population, knowing with confidence that they may never face consequences for their actions. In 2007, inmate William Anthony Bullock was stabbed to death with a shank during an altercation that prison officials seemed powerless to prevent, despite advance warning signs. In 2010, Stephen Prater was killed in a fight that represented not an anomaly, but part of an established pattern of violence that former inmates described in terms that challenged comprehension. A former inmate who survived years at Pollock provided testimony that puts the facility's violence in historical perspective, describing the mid-2000s as resembling 1960s Vietnam, with over a dozen murders occurring in just 18 months and dozens of stabbings happening every single month. This wasn't hyperbole or exaggeration. It was a clinical description of a facility where human life had become so devalued that deadly violence was as routine and predictable as meals or shift changes. If Louisiana's killing fields seem like the ultimate nightmare, prepare yourself. The environment itself becomes torture next. USP Victorville. USP Victorville is a high-security facility with a capacity of 960 male inmates, operational since 2004 as part of the larger federal correctional complex that includes multiple security levels. The facility features the standard maximum security infrastructure, double fencing with razor wire, sophisticated electronic detection systems, extensive surveillance camera networks, armed patrols, and a special housing unit, SIU, specifically designed for inmates requiring the most restrictive confinement conditions available. Recent reports and investigations have painted a picture of systematic dysfunction that goes far beyond typical prison management challenges, revealing an institution where basic safety protocols have broken down so completely that both staff and inmates face daily exposure to life-threatening conditions. In April 2025, the facility was thrust into national headlines when 10 staff members were exposed to suspected drugs over the course of just 4 days, with 6 requiring immediate hospitalization due to the severity of their reactions to whatever substances had penetrated the facility's supposedly secure perimeter. This incident wasn't isolated, but part of a broader pattern of security failures that demonstrates the complete breakdown of basic institutional controls. The American Federation of Government Employees has harshly criticized the Bureau of Prisons for providing inadequate protection to staff and inmates, citing a staggering 600% increase in prison overdose incidents that directly correlates with the failure of mail screening procedures and contraband interdiction efforts. Violence within the facility remains endemic and often deadly, with incidents that suggest either inadequate supervision or deliberate indifference to inmate safety. Notable cases include a 51-year-old inmate who was found dead after an altercation in 2023, representing not an anomaly but part of a pattern of deadly confrontations that seem to occur with disturbing regularity. Multiple inmates were found unresponsive throughout 2024, with outcomes that suggest either violence, drug overdoses, or medical emergencies that weren't addressed with sufficient speed or competence. But perhaps most damning of all are the detailed reports of systematic institutional racism and discrimination that create a toxic environment affecting everyone within the facility's walls. A comprehensive 2023 investigation revealed systematic racist and sexist discrimination by corrections officers, including Confederate flags being openly displayed on personal vehicles in the facility parking lot, and racist imagery being used to demean and intimidate colleagues. Black officers reported being subjected to derogatory racial slurs, deliberately isolated in dangerous work assignments as a form of retaliation, and facing systematic harassment for filing complaints about discriminatory treatment. The desert showed us environmental torture, but our next destination makes the Mojave look like paradise. USP Hazleton. USP Hazleton houses approximately 1,409 male inmates in its high-security facility, and while it gained widespread media coverage for the brutal 2018 murder of Boston crime boss James "Whitey" Bulger, though Bulger wasn't a cartel member, his killing highlighted the facility's dangerous environment and complete failure to protect even the most high-profile inmates from deadly violence. The institutional problems at Hazleton run far deeper than individual incidents of violence, representing systemic failures that make the facility dangerous for everyone within its walls. In 2023, the facility was reportedly operating with a shortage of 84 correctional officers, a staffing crisis so severe that it forced prison administrators to resort to dangerous expedients, including excessive overtime that left guards exhausted and error-prone, and the systematic reassignment of non-custodial staff, including cooks, nurses, and maintenance workers, to guard duties for which they were neither trained nor equipped. Union President Justin Taravisky noted that these shortages create an environment where both inmates and staff face unacceptable dangers, with inmates able to exploit gaps in supervision while staff struggle to maintain even basic security protocols. The violence that results from these institutional failures is both frequent and deadly, creating an atmosphere of constant fear and unpredictability that affects every aspect of daily life within the facility. In March 2024, 2 inmates died within a horrifying 24-hour period, one from a suspected drug overdose that highlights the facility's complete failure to control contraband, and another from an apparent assault that demonstrates the inability of staff to protect inmates from deadly violence. A January 2024 inmate death was also attributed to homicide, while gang-related stabbings have become so common that they're barely newsworthy within the facility's walls. Perhaps most damning of all are the detailed whistleblower reports that emerged in 2023, exposing levels of staff misconduct so severe and systematic that they represent not isolated incidents of individual corruption, but evidence of institutional culture that tolerates and even encourages abuse. These reports detailed horrific staff misconduct, including physical and sexual assaults on inmates, forcing prisoners to urinate and defecate on themselves as a condition of release from restrictive housing, falsifying official documents to cover up escapes and abuse incidents, and using racial slurs as standard practice. These weren't allegations made by disgruntled inmates with axes to grind. They were detailed, corroborated reports from staff whistleblowers who risked their careers and personal safety to expose systematic abuse that violated not just professional standards, but basic human decency. If you think the mountains represent peak cruelty, wait until you see where promises of protection become the cruelest lie. USP Coleman II. USP Coleman II is a high-security federal prison completed in 2004, housing approximately 965, 1,400 male inmates within the larger Coleman Federal Correctional Complex that includes multiple facilities of varying security levels. The prison's design incorporates all the standard features of maximum security incarceration: 12 housing units arranged around a central recreation yard, sophisticated cell phone dampening technology designed to prevent unauthorized communications, and extensive audio and visual surveillance systems. The facility has gained particular notoriety for housing high-profile cartel members, including Benjamin Arellano Felix, the former leader of the notorious Tijuana Cartel, who pleaded guilty in 2013 to conspiracy and money laundering charges for directing the importation of thousands of tons of cocaine into the United States. The Tijuana Cartel, under Felix's brutal leadership, was responsible for over 1,000 deaths during his reign of terror, making his incarceration at Coleman II a testament to the facility's role in housing individuals whose crimes have shocked even seasoned law enforcement professionals. Violence at Coleman II has been both frequent and shocking in its brutality. Notable incidents include the 2011 murder of inmate Wo Se Pianki Shabaki, who was serving a life sentence when he was killed by another prisoner, and the 2008 stabbing death of Stephen Pritchard, who was killed by Boyd Wallace Higginbotham Jr. in the facility's dining hall in broad daylight, an incident that resulted in Higginbotham receiving an additional life sentence. More recently, the 2023 stabbing of Larry Nassar, who was attacked multiple times in his cell reportedly after making a lewd comment, highlighted the ongoing risks faced even by high-profile inmates who might be expected to receive additional protection. The institutional problems extend far beyond inmate-on-inmate violence to include systematic staff misconduct that further undermines any sense of safety or institutional integrity. Cases include a guard indicted in 2018 for lying about a romantic relationship with an inmate, a former correctional officer sentenced in 2023 to 15 months for sexually abusing an inmate between 2018 and 2019, and a former officer sentenced in 2021 for smuggling methamphetamine into the prison in exchange for money. The facility's high security measures, while necessary for controlling dangerous inmates, create their own form of psychological torture through systematic isolation and control. Inmates are often confined to 1 or 2 person cells for most of the day, with limited movement and interaction. The Special Housing Unit, SHU, functions as a prison within a prison, where inmates who violate rules or require protective custody face even more restrictive conditions that can include months or years of near-total isolation. False promises are cruel torture, but our final destination abandons all pretense of civilization completely. MDC Brooklyn. The Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn houses approximately 1,121 to 1,372 inmates, primarily those awaiting trial in federal courts in Brooklyn or Manhattan, as well as some serving short sentences. The facility holds both male and female prisoners of all security levels and operates as the primary federal detention center for the New York metropolitan area, making it a natural destination for high-profile defendants, including alleged cartel members and other notorious criminals. The facility has gained particular notoriety for housing suspected cartel leaders, including Ismael El Mayo Zambada Garcia, a suspected leader of the Sinaloa cartel who was transferred to MDC Brooklyn in 2024 to face murder and drug trafficking charges. 2 fatal stabbings occurred during the summer of 2024 alone, with Uriel White stabbed in the neck on June 7th and Edwin Cordero dying from a chest wound on July 17th. Even more disturbing was an April 2024 incident in which an MS-13 gang member stabbed another inmate 44 times in an attack that was captured on surveillance cameras, though the victim somehow survived this savage assault. Inmates report widespread rodent and cockroach infestations, extensive mold growth that creates toxic air conditions, and overflowing toilets that create unsanitary conditions throughout the facility. The facility's infrastructure problems reached crisis levels during a 2019 power outage during a winter cold snap that left inmates without heat or light for an entire week, creating conditions that were not just uncomfortable, but potentially life-threatening. The judicial response to MDC Brooklyn's conditions has been unprecedented in its severity and scope. U.S. District Judge Gary R. Brown described the facility as a place where chaos reigns, along with uncontrolled violence, language that is remarkable coming from a federal judge who would normally be expected to support the correctional system. The systematic breakdown of security at MDC Brooklyn is perhaps most clearly demonstrated by the rampant presence of contraband throughout the facility. Drugs, cell phones, and weapons flow freely within the facility, with some contraband being smuggled in by correctional officers themselves. The scope of this corruption was highlighted by cases such as a former officer charged in March 2025 with attempting to smuggle marijuana and cigarettes in his protective vest, and the discovery of an MS-13 associate who had smuggled 18 cell phones and marijuana into the facility. Perhaps most disturbing of all was a December 2023 case in which inmate Dajan McBean used a contraband cell phone to orchestrate a murder-for-hire plot from within MDC Brooklyn, resulting in 2 shootings outside a Queens nightclub. If you enjoyed watching this video, then go ahead and click on any of the cards on your screen, Fatmore.